I'm Dr. Vanessa Sinclair, and this is Rendering Unconscious. My guest today is Dr. Derek Hook, Professor of Psychology at Duquesne University and psychoanalytic practitioner.
Okay, so maybe three areas then. I'll speak a little bit about the conference and the related book series, reading Lacan's Decree, the books, the two that have come out so far. And then maybe if we've got a bit of time, I'll also just speak about some of the more politically applied psychoanalysis, Lacanian analysis that I've been working on, which is more about Fanon, racism, the South African context, which, I don't know, listeners may find of some interest. So how does that sound?
Wonderful.
Okay, great. All right, so first is just to make mention of the Lacan's Decree conference, which we'll be hosting here in Pittsburgh between the 11th of October and the 13th of October. So that's Friday, Saturday, Sunday. We're pretty excited about the event. We really organized the conference to launch the second of the volumes that Stijn van Heulen, Callum Neal, and myself have edited with the title Reading Lacan's Decree. The second of those volumes has just come out about a week ago. So that book will launch at the conference, and we'll also have copies of the first volume of that book, and I'll speak about those volumes in a little bit more detail. But just to say, we have a terrific lineup: Annie Rogers, Patricia Geravici, Stephanie Swales, Bruce Finkelby, also actually launching his new translation of Seminar 6. Stijn van Heulen, Callum Neal are also doing keynotes, and we've got a really nice spread of clinicians, theoreticians, Lacanian scholars from North America and Europe. We're also hoping that we'll get some PhD students, and that's getting pretty close now. So there's a great conference website if people want to have a look at that. All you have to do is search for Lacan's Decree Conference Pittsburgh is probably a good idea as well. So that's kind of the big event on the horizon. And then maybe I'll just say a little bit about the book series. The book series began actually maybe 5 or 6 years ago already, at least the ideas for it. And Stijn had suggested to me initially that he would like to do a series of definitive readings of the different sections of Lacan's Decree, which was a great idea because, there's been several books that have done, well, actually not several. I mean, I can think of the Muller and Richardson, Lacan and Language, which was a kind of early text doing a similar kind of job. And that had always been, going back a little bit now, maybe 10, 15 years, that had always been the kind of lifesaver for me because, you jump into the Decree, and unless you've got some kind of guide rails or some kind of reading group or some kind of expert guidance, it's really difficult to make much headway. So I'd always loved the Muller and Richardson, and always thought that it would be nice to have more expanded versions of those kinds of close text commentaries and readings. So that's what we try to do. And then we started inviting people to contribute. And that wasn't an uncomplicated process because people often would prefer just to engage with one of Lacan's decrees in a kind of more tangential way, or do that en route to talking about their own work and their own ideas. But it wasn't that frequent that we'd find people who were willing to make a sustained, detailed engagement at a paragraph level with the text. So some people initially wanted to do it, then didn't and fell away. Other people stuck with it, and a couple of people stuck with it so well that they ended up with full book-length manuscripts. I'm talking about Adrian Johnston and Danny Nobis, which was delightful. But of course, we had to negotiate a certain issue there as well, because their book-length manuscripts, which were absolutely fantastic, and just particularly thinking of those chapters in the Decree that hadn't received detailed commentary in English, because obviously by the time 2006 comes around and Bruce Fink has published the complete translation, the full Acree translation, books like Muller and Richardson and others that commented on the more limited selected papers at Acree hadn't engaged with some of these Acree. Mm-hmm. So it was great to have the lengthier versions, but it would have made a kind of lopsided volume of the series if in one of the reading Lacan's Acree titles we'd had 70,000 words just on the Freudian thing, whatever. So that took a little bit of negotiation with various publishers, but we were happy to both be able to bring out those two, Adrian Johnson's book on the Freudian thing and Danny Nobes's book on Kant of Exard as full titles with another book series with Palgrave, and then also have slightly shorter versions for the reading Lacan's Acree. But just to say that it's been a rather tricky exercise in some respects, but a lot of the material we've got has been fantastic. And to my mind, I mean, I suppose it sounds like bragging or something, but I'm really happy that we've managed to get those books out there, because getting that number of extensive commentaries, expositions for the full Acree is not something that's existed before. And I'm hoping it will encourage more engagements with the Acree itself, and also more. I hope it's an encouragement to further elaborations and articulations that go beyond simply the commentary on texts.
No, it's such a fantastic collection, and I've decided that a couple episodes ago I interviewed Todd McGowan about his chapter, the first chapter in the first collection, and I've decided that I want to go through each chapter and interview everybody who wrote in it, because I think it's so important.
Oh, okay, that'd be great. That's a terrific idea. And funnily enough, Todd's chapter on signification of the phallus, in a way, opens, well, I suppose it does open the series, which of course begs the question of, like, if you're doing a text by text reading of every text in Acree, why start there? But having said that, it's a terrific place to start, because I mean, we're not going to have a competition about which is the most opaque contribution to the Acree, but signification of the phallus is something that in reading groups and with students and with fellow colleagues, one tries to take a big bite-sized chunk out of, but it's I don't know. I've always found it difficult to really bring much out of that text. In fact, it seems one of the contributions to the Acree that, at least to my mind, has within the field of social theory and cultural critique and so on and so forth, invited so much projection that it's very few commentaries that I've read or engagements that I've read have been as concise and incisive as Todd's. And Todd's just done a great job with that, I think. And it's particularly important, as it has turned out, it wasn't planned, but that his paper begins the book series because, it's hard to think of a more controversial Lacanian notion than the phallus, right? Or a psychoanalytic notion than the phallus. And I just think he does a great job in making the critical argument for the importance of a concept, which seems in many academic contexts that I've been involved in to be automatically derided and elided and dismissed from discussion.
How did it turn out that was the first? Because I asked him and he didn't know why.
Well, there is a good explanation, but I figure if I give you the explanation, then the answer is known, and then we just deflate the enigma.
Then it's no fun anymore. Okay.
Longer, and yeah, we'll find an opportunity. Hey, Vanessa, are you coming to our conference?
In Duquesne, I can't. No, but I want to. There has to be.
I'll tell you the answer to the enigma.
I know, but there has to be a third one for the third book, and it has to be in Scotland because that's where Callum is. So I want to definitely be at that one.
Okay. So that's the plan, actually. Hopefully that we'll all get it together in Edinburgh, and that's an interesting topic in its own right. I mean, without going on too much of a tangent, but I remember years and years ago in London, Bernard Burgoyne did an interesting talk where I don't know if he was trying to slightly polemicize the issue, but he was saying, wouldn't it be interesting if we could move do an alternative genealogy of the development of psychoanalysis and move the epicenter of this genealogical map to Edinburgh, I think he said, or it was somewhere in Scotland, presumably Edinburgh, rather than just always return to the notion of Vienna and Freud and all the rest of it, which was really kind of interesting. Anyway, sorry, that's a little bit of a tangent, but the nice thing about trying to have it in different locations like that is hopefully we'll be able to, at this coming conference, get a good contingent of North American Lacanians, and at the following one, following up from the first conference that Stein organized in 2018 in Ghent, we'll have a good core European contingent, which I suppose makes me think that maybe come 2021 we should go visit Australia or something. What do you think, Vanessa?
I think that would be wonderful.
Okay, so now we're cooking up a wicked plan. We just got to figure out who we give who we beg to host and organize something in. Actually, that's a good idea, but I'm thinking maybe New Zealand, because I can think of someone there who might be willing to do it. Anyway,
yeah, and there's a great analyst named Ingo Lambrecht in New Zealand that I'm sure would help.
Well, I wonder if she's listening and thinking, oh my gosh, what's happening? These guys are cooking up a plan in public and I've not even heard anything about it yet. But okay, good. Let's ask her if she'll do it. Okay, so I've given you a little bit of a description of those projects, the conference. I could talk a little bit about some of the current work that I'm doing.
Please do.
I mean, okay, so one of all right, so let me start with an anecdote. I remember starting to read Lacan, starting to read Freud, and particularly when it came around to notions of sexuation, and some of the aligned concepts that we've made mention of already, notions of the phallus, whatever. I remember, while still living in South Africa, thinking that for me, a lot of these concepts, although they didn't directly map onto these axes, these dimensions of otherness, difference, whatever, they seem also to me to speak to the dimension of race. And in fact, in some respects, seem to me to be even more pertinent to that political axis of identification, more so than sexuation. Now, I'm exaggerating slightly, but just to say that it's an interesting question to ask how one picks up Lacanian theory in what political context with what particular priorities. So in many respects, I think after moving from South Africa to London and becoming affiliated with the psychoanalytic training group there and being involved in teaching and reading a lot of the material, I think then for a while I kind of stepped back from its more overt political application. But recently I find that in trying to think certain political dilemmas, I think Lacanian social theory is just hugely important. Now, I know there's some debates here. So Bruce Fink, for example, and other colleagues might say, well, look, it's first and foremost a clinical vocabulary. It's a set of clinical instruments. And funnily enough, I agree with that. I agree with that argument. And I think you could say that every time you think about trying to apply some of these concepts and utilize them outside the clinic, maybe you've got 1 foot on the potential of a potential banana peel, and that banana peel is wild analysis, right? So I think that's true, and I take those critiques to heart. But there's other moments when I think it's absolutely essential to involve some kind of psychoanalytic or Lacanian theorization in terms of how to engage dimensions of power, of political questions, and so on and so forth. And maybe I could just give one brief example. Although, let me just also preface it by saying, I don't think it always necessarily works. I think you can find bad attempts to apply psychoanalysis and Lacan or less than successful attempts to apply Lacan and psychoanalysis to the political field. And you can find ones that are more incisive and more useful. But one of the pieces of work that I've just finished up is a paper looking at the uses Frantz Fanon makes of particularly Lacanian psychoanalysis. It's a bit of a complicated undertaking because there's been a fair amount of literature which has attempted to do that before, and in the later 80s and early 90s, there was the heyday of Homi Bhabha, where there was very much an attempt in some ways to do a kind of Lacanian phenonism. But there's been a couple of recent publications, a book by Nigel Gibson and a colleague called Beneduce, which looks at Fanon's work, politics, psychiatry. And then recently, I think it only appeared last year, a book called Alienation and Freedom by Jean Culfer and Robert Young, which collects a whole bunch of Fanon's very early psychiatric writings. And this became fascinating to me because I think since the heyday of the Homi Bhabha engagement with Fanon, there's been such a massive backlash against Lacan in some of that critical race theory, post-colonial theory, and particularly in Fanon studies. And for a long time now, maybe going on as long as 20 years, my sense is David Macy, funnily enough, who wrote a book both on a biography of Fanon and, interestingly, a fairly extensive engagement with Lacan earlier on in his career. He was a kind of figurehead of this by saying, no, you guys are trying to overly turn Fanon into a Lacanian, and he just finds this all very problematic. So there's been this big backlash against trying to do Lacan and Fanon together. And again, one can be sympathetic to some of the critical reasons why that might be the case. Fanon himself is obviously highly critical of some applications of psychoanalysis, but it seems to me that the backlash was maybe too strong, in as much as I think there really are some very interesting uses that Fanon makes of Lacan. Beyond the usual applications and theorizations of how he thinks the mirror stage. So I don't want to go into all the details of it, but what I started to do in trying to look at both the only recently translated and published Fanon writings, particularly his PhD thesis, where he does engage some of Lacan's very early ideas in a very enthusiastic way, and I think in a sophisticated way as well, is that there's maybe more of Lacan in early Fanon than many Fanonian scholars have wanted to admit. And then I think that there's some very promising and interesting contemporary work where Lacanian social theorists like Sheldon George, for example, like David Marriott, are going and looking to see how you can use Lacan to further extend Fanonian forms of theorization. And just to cut a long story short, I think one of the very crucial areas where that has started to happen, certainly upon doing a kind of, whatever, to use a silly word, a kind of meta-analysis of those studies, is I think Lacanian psychoanalysis and Freudian psychoanalysis done well and taken to the domain of Fanon and extending Fanon helps us analyze the temporality of racism, or gives us a way of mapping and conceiving racist temporality. And I think that's a crucial contribution, and it's not something that I'm seeing elsewhere in the literature, maybe with the isolated examples of a few phenomenological engagements with that topic. So, sorry, there's a long kind of narrative rant, but just to say, for me, that has been one of the more promising ways of saying two things. One, maybe it's worthwhile thinking again how certain forms of decolonizing critique, Fanon included, might still be usefully linked to or further articulated with facets of Lacanian social theory. That's point number one. And point number two is that if one does that in a viable way, in an incisive way, one can start to broaden, to further the array of conceptual critiques and forms of analysis. And for me, I think one of the places where contemporary Lacanians are doing that with Fanon is to think in a variety of different ways about what might constitute racist temporality, what racist temporality is made up of, the operations of it, the modalities, interpolation, so on and so forth. So I suppose we could think of other examples, and I could give some other examples, but that's just one very promising place where Lacanian social theory can be linked to a kind of Fanonian agenda.
And how are you applying this?
Well, there are a couple of papers that have recently come out. One is about the notion of petrification. So thinking about the post-apartheid South African context, it's a place which is historically specific, obviously, which is different to other places. But oddly enough, the longer I live in the United States, I can start to see some quite striking parallels to race politics, struggles, issues that occur in the post-apartheid context and in the highly racialized public sphere of the United States. Mm-hmm. So there are a couple of potential parallels there. Something that I've just finished up work on is a paper on white anxiety, and I know that the concept of whiteness and whiteness studies is a big one, and it's gained momentum, and it's kind of omnipresent in critical race theory. And I've tried to explore this literature, and I think there's many valuable contributions there. But as part of the, cultural norm of often, kind of automatic rejection of many psychoanalytic concepts, I don't think there's been much by way of, or that I found a particularly useful psychoanalytic engagement, or certainly Lacanian engagement with the notion of whiteness. Mm-hmm. So in this recent paper, what I do is I try to ask questions about what is the particular notion of white fragility. So this is Robin DiAngelo's concept that she uses critically, very usefully, I think, in the United States. But my question is, well, is it always just fragility? She means multiple things by that. And of course, it is, I think, somewhat different in a South African context where whiteness is perhaps more on the back foot than it is in a place like the United States, where today, obviously, whiteness, if anything, seems to be on the aggressively oriented front foot position. So my question then was, how would we conceptualize something like not just white fragility, but extend that notion of white fragility to ask about the phantasmatic dimensions of white fragility, or the anxiety underlying formations of white fragility, particularly in South Africa. And one of the interesting elements that came through from that paper is it made me suddenly think that District 9, the movie? That District 9 is a nice example of something of what's going on. And one of the points that I tried to make in that paper is to collect a variety of texts from the popular culture realm within South Africa that seem to ask the question of what will whiteness be now that it's very seriously threatened with the prospect of no longer being able to persist as in a hegemonic way, with a kind of hegemonic degree of dominance. And for me, that's, I don't know why, maybe it should be something that I find more, threatening or disturbing or whatever, being white myself, but I find it fascinating, this negotiation and a whole series of themes of posited extinction. And in fact, a colleague in South Africa had done a presentation maybe 2 years ago now, where he had asked the question, what would white suicide be? And, he was obviously doing this as a kind of polemicized ethical problematization rather than some, kind of literal imperative, but ended up receiving all sorts of death threats and really having a bad time because of that. Mm. But to me, it seemed like a nice ethical moment and a nice ethical problematization to really ask the question of, well, what does it mean if you invested phantasmatically in terms of your enjoyment in some notion of whiteness to actually come a little bit closer to the prospect of dealing with the situation of you may not be, or your whiteness, whatever you signify by that, may become itself a kind of persona non grata in the future. So it's difficult to communicate all of this if people aren't particularly familiar with that context. But in District 9, of course, we have this situation where there's the kind of Afrikaans-speaking white South African guy who gets involved in whatever agency is supposed to be dealing with these aliens. And in the course of the film, he gets somehow infected by the prawns, or whatever these guys are called, and starts the transformation into one of them. And thinking about it, it seemed such a nice intersection point for three different texts. One, okay, District 9, this kind of over-the-top, sensationalizing, kind of funny, disturbing science fiction film. Number two, I mean, it's hard not to think of Kafka and, the metamorphosis into some kind of insect.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, thirdly, the other intersection point, which from a Lacanian perspective is kind of funny but interesting and I think fruitful, actually, despite that it sounds so very contingent, is the section right towards the end of, is it seminar 9 or 10 before, seminar 10's anxiety, right? So I think it must be towards the end of the identification seminar where Lacan first gives it, this little vignette of the praying mantis and this anxiety-provoking situation. And of course he uses this as a kind of paradigmatic example that he repeats again at the beginning of the anxiety seminar. This terrifying, disturbing, ego-dissipating moment whereby you, the subject, come online, become aware, and you realize that you've got some kind of mask, something that fixed your face, you can't see what it is, but you can see through this apparent mask that there's a giant praying mantis looking at you. You don't know if the mask is of a male praying mantis, which presumably is not a good sign. You don't know what's there. And so you have a crisis that is redoubled because it's not only a crisis of who I am, what is my identity, what's my imaginary visual identity in the situation, but you also have the very real crisis of like, will I perish? Will I be consumed here? And also you could extend the argument, so it's not just the Lacanian imaginary and the Lacanian real, but it's also the symbolic domain of what is my meaning here, what is my pertinence here? And of course, I'm arguing that is precisely the kind of situation that many white South Africans, and presumably myself, certainly when I'm in South Africa, are negotiating. That kind of triple sense of anxiety about, well, what will my role be here? What can I do? Do I? What is the kind of contribution? And of course, in many post-colonial situations, you could say that is a kind of subterranean question. Do I deserve to still be here? And of course, maybe it's extended also with a sense of the accountability of that which I typically avoid cognizing, thinking about. But to cut a long story short, there we have it, a nice conceptual intersection between those three texts, which I think tells us something interesting or could be used in a profitable way to spark off some intuitions, some critical thoughts about the crises or multiple crises of whiteness and white anxiety. But what I think was particularly interesting about how District 9 engages with this is that, and a series of other texts that are produced in the South African context particularly, is that Vickers is the name of the guy who starts to do this transformation. He does start to have a transformation. He does become something else. Now, in other kind of science fiction texts and other literary texts that come out of South Africa, those questions are obviously often underlined with a kind of racism, which implies this, oh, things have changed so much, now look what we've lost. So you get this kind of post-imperial nostalgia for what was. And even in a very different cultural context like the United Kingdom, I mean, I actually do think that's one way of reading the whole Brexit thing, that there's this kind of like narcissistic sense of a loss of greatness that now, and there's too much infiltration of other forms of identity which are watering down our former sense of greatness, so on and so forth. So when we do get into this whole genre of Armageddon, of apocalypse, of extinction, as it's theorized in cultural terms, it does sound like it brings with it more than its fair share of racist nostalgia, let us put it that way. But I think what might also be apparent in some of those kinds of texts is a sense that maybe one way of reading District 9 and other texts of this sort is not just to say, okay, it's a quasi-racist text which is saying how good it was, but maybe it's an invitation of sorts to consider how identification and the identificatory investments in some imaginary notion of whiteness might indeed actually be fundamentally challenged, and might in fact be challenged in a way which doesn't necessarily have to lead back to the knee-jerk reaction of reiterated, reaffirmed whiteness. In other words, how do those kind of science fiction texts open up the possibility that identification might be differently made? There might be different forms of identificatory investment. So back to the colleague of mine who made this comment about what would it mean to think conceptually about something like a gesture of white suicide. Obviously, it's polemical. Obviously, it's a little bit over the top. But I think in an interesting kind of way, that question does allow for a thinking of what it would mean to be me, where the conditions of being the me that I am now are no longer possible. And to bring that back to Lacanian theory, just in case everybody thought, like, my gosh, this has taken us a fairly long way from our point of departure, is it not the case that in Seminar 7, Lacan also asks this question, or he gives us this, as it were, almost like an ethical challenge? And I'm not going to quote it directly because I can't remember it, but I think he says somewhere within Seminar 7 something like, a psychoanalysis that doesn't bring the subject closely to or very close to the question, or let's not prevaricate here, a psychoanalysis in which the analysand does not seriously confront the question of whether to live or to die or under what conditions life might go on is not really a successful analysis. Now again, I mean, maybe that's a little bit over the top, but I think there is a similar kind of ethical opportunity, an echo of one reading of what Lacan says in Seminar 7 about a serious confrontation with one's sense of mortality and what subjective destitution, in fact, might ultimately mean, and what certain socially, politically, historically dominant groups, whiteness in particular, might need to think, might need to facilitate, might need to wonder. And it's a dangerous suggestion because the closer we get to a position where a previously dominant group is confronted with their mortality, with the fact that they might perish, with the assumption that they will not have some ongoing symbolic historical viability, the more you do have, and I mean, this is another way of reading a whole Donald Trump situation, a very energetic, very aggressive, knee-jerk reaction, wanting to reassert one's dominance. So it's a risky political strategy. But on the other hand, if there is a possibility where the very presence of one's prospective end, extinction, mortality, perishability, can be facilitated, and the subject can withstand that, withstand a fair injection of anxiety, and a kind of mortifying anxiety, but not ultimately do the knee-jerk reaction thing. I think that can be a very valuable political, societal, and indeed ethical moment of well, reflection is not quite the right word here, but of potential change and shifting. Sorry, you better ask me a question because that, I'm running out of words, man. That was quite wordy and convoluted, so apologies for the long, extensive thesis.
No, it's actually very clear, and it seems like that's what really needs to happen. Like, what is this identity if not identified with oppressing others?
Actually, what was also maybe every now and again, I think, well, the psychoanalytic theory thing is useful. It's helpful, and it does genuinely. I don't know why, but for me, this is particularly a kind of Lacanian possibility. It's so important for a type of ethical speculation, and I mean ethical here in a particular sense. I mean ethical in the sense of the potential change of the subject. And it's funny because sometimes people, you go to different universities, or I do a talk or whatever, and people say like, "Oh yeah, but okay, good. What are your truth claims here? This sounds like you're doing something speculative." And I suppose for me, when that question comes up, what's the epistemic substance of your claims here? It seems to me that one way of thinking the ongoing viability and importance, both of Lacanian theory more generally and Lacanian social theory, is precisely consider its role as a form of ethical commentary and speculation. And again, by ethical commentary, what I mean is not to say that this is necessarily some kind of science. Even it may not even be a speculative science, as somewhere I think Lacan ruminates, but maybe that it's a kind of ethical discourse whereby one considers what it does mean or might mean for there to be some kind of change, both in the conditions of a given subject and in a subject community. So, I mean, I hadn't really, I suppose, thought that through until speaking to you now. But for me, that's a very important trajectory or important element of how Lacanian theory might be utilized, and also how it could be contextualized. Because I think, the perennial problem is people, you see psychoanalytic theory as this armature, this kind of super conceptual theorization, which gives us these dazzling insights and critiques of this, and that. Maybe. But I think for me, it's not so much about assembling, an absolute edifice of Lacanian social theory, as much as seeing how it might allow us precisely that, a degree of ethical problematization and ethical questioning. So, yeah, I kind of like that.
Definitely. And I think it's really important now for psychoanalysis, or for us to think about the political psychoanalytically in this ethical manner. Because I was at this conference recently here in Stockholm that Lene Osted put together on psychoanalysis and politics. And one of the conversations during that conference was about this kind of reticence for psychoanalysis to speak about social issues and political issues, and to kind of just maintain focus in the clinic, in the consulting room. And different people had different perspectives on that, on both sides, and if we should shift or not. And I really think it's important to speak about society more at this juncture in time.
Yeah, I mean, I'm kind of maybe making kind of an adjacent point rather than speaking directly to that. But I suppose for me, once one is clear about the parameters of what one is trying to do by utilizing those ideas, it's not so much to make proclamations about the essential structure of society, or these ongoing transhistorical notions of whatever it may be. The transhistorical nature of the Oedipus complex, or so on and so forth. And funnily enough, talking about Fanon, he, of course, makes precisely that critique of psychoanalysis, and interestingly uses Lacan to do it, which is kind of a nice, footnote in the history of how Lacan himself is sometimes quite useful in a critique of certain, what we might call excessive Freudianisms or something. But yeah, I think it's much more about being able to say, if we're going to be able to use this, and we're cognizant of the critique of what the more hardcore clinicians who don't think that this language, these theories, can accurately be implemented or utilized outside the clinic. Maybe one way of doing that is to say that we're not making huge truth claims here, but what we're using it for is, in a speculative way, in a questioning way, to precisely ask, well, what might be possible? What might be the conditions of change? What might be the ethical role of psychoanalytic discourse to ask how things could shift, and maybe even more importantly, what are those resistances to how things might shift? And I think that would be a useful contextualizing way to try to utilize some Lacanian ideas in terms of political discourse. Funnily enough, as I was speaking, I was also thinking there's such a nice case in point of how some kind of similar ideas to what I was talking about in terms of whiteness and the recalcitrance of white identity and the phantasmatic investments in whiteness. And a very similar argument is made by Edward Said in the end of the lecture he does at the Freud Museum. And there's a little book of his on Freud and the non-European, and he does this interesting contrapuntal rereading of Moses and monotheism. And he basically makes the argument. He says, well, Freud's already there in some respect, and isn't it interesting how we can use Freud to read him today to think about some issues, particularly the Israel-Palestinian crisis, and basically ends that text by saying, well, what is cosmopolitan? What might be the cosmopolitan? And one definition or one approach to thinking a cosmopolitan identity is precisely a wounded identity. Not necessarily wounded in, oh, I'm narcissistically wounded, look at me, my poor woundedness, but in the more precise sense of avoiding a closure of identity. In other words, and I mean, this to me sounds like totally Lacanian, although he's not articulating in those terms, the attractiveness in terms of imaginary closure, of being able to settle upon a firm, substantiated image of a seemingly resolved or transparent identity unto oneself that gives one this kind of impression, this mirage of ego cohesion, of an identity. This is the thing that Edward Said is saying, well, a model, a notion of woundedness, of non-closure, of openness, of constant openness, that is resistant to the seductions and attractions of a closure of identity, is precisely what he thinks works best as a model for a cosmopolitan identity. In other words, it's precisely a resistance to the charms of an imaginarized identity that might be closed, that might be definitive in what it means to be whatever, American, a man, whatever. And I think that fits very well with some of the ideas we've been playing with. And I think what's also interesting about that, though, just to add one last point, is Said also explicitly says something like, this is not an identity which is ultimately comfortable. It's not a palliative. It's not something that will necessarily make one feel better about oneself. But it's, I mean, if we were trying to do some kind of theoretical linking here, we might say, or we might ask the question, what do we get if we put together Lacanian ideas of subjective destitution with something like Said's model of cosmopolitanism, or indeed with this notion of a kind of punctured whiteness, or that I was speculating about earlier.
And I think that's a good place to lead into your book, because I wanted to make sure to talk about your book, 6 Moments in Lacan, Communication and Identification in Psychology and Psychoanalysis.
Oh, great. Yeah, thanks. Okay, well, yeah, that... It's a book. I sometimes, it's more of an introductory text in many respects, and I'm both proud of the book, but I also sometimes think, the colleagues who've, done these more intensive academic scholarly scrutiny of Lacanian texts or whatever, in a way that work seems to move in a different realm altogether. Well, for me, the 6 Moments in Lacan book was very much an outcome of teaching, trying to teach, hopefully with some success, Lacanian ideas, both at a undergrad level and at a graduate level, in contexts where Lacan was just not otherwise on the table. So I started when I was teaching social psychology at the London School of Economics, which is not really a hotbed of Lacanian activity, as you can imagine. So looking back on the book now, I'm proud of it in as much as I think it does a nice job of being able to isolate 6 moments, one of which would be, wow, people are always talking about the other and otherness and othering in psychology, but one of the crucial of my arbitrary or semi-arbitrary 6 moments in Lacan would be to say, well, what do you mean when you talk about that? You talk about, and there's a number of these concepts that I find and did find in the world of social psychology and psychology more generally, and not just within the academic domain of psychology, but in the kind of popular domain of how people use psychological concepts. Otherness is one, subjectivity is another, identity is a third. And of course, the list goes on. But what I think was useful about the book was saying, all right, we're going to try and do some work today. You come to class, as have I, with a series of concepts that, although we may not realize it, have been fundamentally informed by everyday psychological notions. And that includes some psychoanalytic notions. how are we going to rethink them? How do we give them a degree of analytical specificity? How do we add a degree of rigor here? How do we think differently about a whole variety of even quite mundane everyday events, from a moment of finding a message in a bottle on a beach, this kind of proverbial thing which comes up in, funny enough, there's a news item that's just come up, perhaps that's why it's come into my mind. From that to the example of what is the function of monumental sculpture? Why have monuments? What are they there for? And once we've got those ideas, and in the book there were a bunch of them. Okay, so identity I've mentioned, the notion of the other is another one. Subjectivity, basic ideas of communication would be a fourth. What does it mean once we start to take Lacanian theory to those? Well, at a first level, it's worth just noticing that the whole agenda of trying to take Lacanian psychoanalysis to psychology is a kind of catastrophic error. Not to say the book is a total disaster or anything like that, but those two domains actually do not gel. Like there's a kind of non-relation between them. That being said, it is then interesting to say, well, what happens when we can use some very basic examples and start to employ the echo of Lacanian concepts where hitherto we've been relying on more everyday notions of whatever identification might be. So one brief example about that. To say when in everyday society we say, well, I really identify with that person, that seems to imply something more like a wishful emotional attachment or some kind of wished for affinity or perceived affinity. And it doesn't really have very much to do with the psychoanalytic notion of an identification, which can occur at an unconscious level. And it may require, as in Freud's example of hysterical identifications, it may require no affinity. In fact, quite the opposite with the person with whom one has identified in some way. So one of the examples I like, maybe around the 2/3 point in the book, is an example taken from The Rest is Noise, Alec Ross's book about 20th century classical music. And he gives the example of a young Adolf Hitler going off to a Mahler performance, and Hitler talking about how this had been one of the most moving and musical experiences, artistic experiences in his life. And of course, then Ross points to the obvious contradiction. Mahler's Jewish. How do we make sense of the fact that Hitler may have found something quite crucial, quite a crucial identificatory moment or signifier in this performance? And Ross's example is, he says, isn't it interesting that when you watch footage of Hitler and how he uses his hands in certain ways, they seem to have an uncanny similarity to some of the gestures that Mahler used as a conductor. So what's nice about this example is, okay, we've known about this idea of identification, but somehow when we start to talk about a Lacanian concept like identification via a unary trait, we bring into play a whole series of very different ideas to what is commonly utilized when we start to think about in kind of lay psychological or psychologized ideas of identification. And one of those crucial ideas is that identification doesn't necessarily connote affinity or likeness or a warm emotional attachment, but may in fact be unconscious, and it may be formed and utilize an isolated single trait that becomes the basis for a broader type of identificatory function, which is no longer reducible to Mahler, for example. Just one more example is in much social psychology, there's a great deal of talk about what is subjectivity and what is intersubjectivity. In fact, intersubjectivity was, for a while at least, a very hot topic. And I find this interesting, but of course, if you do a bit of Lacanian work and you look at the famous Logical Time, the very early paper, Lacan's Logical Time paper, we start to see that for Lacan, it's not simply a matter of subjectivity and intersubjectivity, because it's easy enough to say that intersubjectivity needn't ever really fundamentally move beyond the terrain of imaginary intersubjectivity. For Lacan, those two concepts aren't going to be adequate. You need something else. You need something like the transsubjective. Or, put that differently, we don't want to think simply about the unconscious merely as something which is of the individual or that's intrapsychic. And neither do we want to think about the conscious unconscious as simply a collective unconscious in the Jungian sense, but we need a trans-individual unconscious to do justice to what Lacan is trying to think and trying to say. And I think that parallels in several important ways this idea of what it means to think about the trans-subjective. And so for me, one of the very, very crucial moments in thinking Lacan's contribution to social theory and to a rethinking or critique of the psychological is the notion of the big other. So we could obviously spend a long time thinking about that. We don't have the time to do that here, but I think that's a very important contribution. And also then to take one step back on the book, I think what the book does do pretty well, and what I was trying to do with it, is to say that by the time one starts talking about basically psychological ideas, commonplace, everyday cultural notions, as well as the discipline of psychology, one is really bringing into play a whole series of prior assumptions and psychologized ideas about what identity, subjectivity, otherness is. And what I think Lacan is very useful for in this respect is to create that sense that there may be vitally different conceptual ways of approaching any number of these concepts, from subjectivity to identification to communication to otherness. And I think that is a very important critical opportunity, and one that I hope that we can take up, and I hope that students who perhaps start in psychology might see that this is a very different set of concepts that could be utilized in a variety of different contexts.
Thank you for listening to Rendering Unconscious. You've just heard a discussion with Dr. Derek Hook, professor at Duquesne University in the Department of Psychology. For link to Dr. Hook's works, as well as the upcoming conference on Lacan's Écrits, please visit our website www.renderingunconscious.org. You can also visit my website, drvanessasinclair.net. Rendering Unconscious is also a book. Rendering Unconscious, Psychoanalytic Perspectives, Politics, and Poetry. Please visit our publisher's website, trapart.net. That's trapart.net. Please support the podcast at our Patreon. You can find the link below or visit www.patreon.com/VANESSA23CARL. Experimentations are taken directly from the third mind itself. But before we begin, I'd like to read a little something. And art set free, imagined a discourse of, smashed against a rock, mentor, and a lasting influence. Some days I find solace in Freud's revolutionary, human nature, and they are forced. Or at least it is easier, and focus in very, very tight. The situation. We can expose the paradoxical nature of our life circumstances and discover Tantra, known to pain, and theory. Jung had a reputation, the same. The skin was thickly covered, often with a view of both analysis and desperate for change. Point toward the ways in which Tantra is preceded. She shattered a mask of my crime. Dream and body and voice, inversion, isolation, reduplication, cancellation, and displacement. But if we were to build on these subjective givens alone, however little free them from the condition of experience that makes us see them as partaking of the nature of a linguistic technique, I do mean atomic. Lungs, leafing from branch to branch, jaguar form ahead of you and waiting. With an invocation of sorts, to situate ourselves and consecrate the space. I, thou, suggested the squamous covering of certain snakes. Below the waist, though, of writing into 4 quadrants and rearranging them. Foisy and Sinclair explore ideas posited by Burroughs and Geisen and expand them. For example, Burroughs speaks about the essence of authors being in their words and encourages us to cut up our favorite writers and poets, rearranging their own theories. Head moving up again, his planet, and in this omniverse, yes, I write, I read, I cast a spell. Hologram is now a being built differently, of course, at the stake. I wonder, play if I listen to now. The third mind movements. Analysis, of course, we're so much of, but also commodified in. Immeasurable freedom sums me up. If I could represent. The cut-up method performed without scissors. As you cut up in the texts of other writers, they become inextricably mixed with yours. Fade out to room. Yes, boys, that's me there. Bowles sits opposite. Something on your mind? Well, yes, you might say. The thought of some of my have strayed up here. Free-range country, maybe a little too free.